and I'm excited to be joined by Koa Beck, who is the former editor-in-chief of Jezebel and co-host of the hashtag #MeToo Memos on WNYC's The Takeaway. Previously, she was the executive for Vogue.com and the senior features editor at MarieClaire.com. Koa, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Benjamin.
The pleasure is ours. I wanted to speak to you in general about your work, your scholarship, and all the things that you do, but also about your book, White Feminism, from the suffragettes to influencers and who they leave behind. Could you tell us about that book and how it intersects with all of your work?
Sure. So I have worked in mainstream women's media for about 10 years. I stepped away from my most recent role to do this book, but I've essentially covered gender, race, queer rights, all kinds of identity politics for really the bulk of my career. And by virtue of many of the newsrooms that I've worked in, and then, stories I've either covered or pitched or assigned out to other people, I have really had a front row seat to mainstream feminism and the ways in which certain interpretations of feminism have become much more palatable, but also just acceptable and in some cases trendy. So in a lot of ways, this book is the culmination of a lot of cultural observations I've had, specifically in tracing mainstream feminism through, movements for gender progress that have not been anchored in a white feminist ideology, such as like Black feminism, certain indigenous women's movements in this country, Chicanas, disabled justice in this country, queer rights, that sort of thing.
Could you draw that line for us as briefly as you can? Obviously, you have a full book and everyone should check it out. But for the sake of this conversation, could you draw that line from white feminism to, like you said, Black feminism and the different iterations of it?
Sure. So I define white feminism very early in my book and in the introduction to give readers a working definition of what I'm tracing, and also, what I'm analyzing. I define white feminism as a very specific approach to achieving gender equality that pulls considerably from colonialism, imperialism, some key pieces of white supremacy as well, and specifically labor exploitation. So the individual accumulation of wealth and autonomy that is then gauged as quote unquote feminist progress. Meanwhile, many other movements and feminisms in this country do not approach gender equality through those lenses. I analyze a number of movements that are very socialist in their execution, but even if they don't necessarily use that word or strictly identify with a socialist approach, they are very collective in their understanding of what feminism is, but also what it should achieve. So exporting a very specific skill set to an individual woman in their community is not necessarily gauged as feminism. What is feminism is everybody having access to clean water, everybody having access to food security, everybody having access to affordable housing.
So if someone is trying to understand this, it sounds like the way that you have defined white feminism is best understood as perhaps challenging some male structures, but not the underlying structures. Like I heard you mention colonialism, capitalism. Am I hearing you correctly?
Yeah, I think that's accurate. I interpret white feminism broadly as not particularly being invested in any structural change. The real key difference I see between white feminism approaches to misogyny and gender equality is, again, exporting this very specific skill set to women that is informed by patriarchy, colonialism, imperialism, and then branding and positioning it as feminist, for you to exploit low-income workers, to take advantage of domestic workers, to basically run, a very powerful company in the way that patriarchy broadly encourages you to do it. Whereas, many other movements, and again, you can really pick a number of them, are much more invested in structural change rather than encouraging women and non-binary people to excel in the current structure.
Yeah, this is fascinating because one of the things just in my personal journey towards liberation and progressivism and understanding my role in these structures, one of the things I had to come to terms with was how my role in patriarchy actually undermines my fight for liberation in every other category. And I'm curious, in your experience, have you ever found anyone who subscribes to white feminism actually understand that it is, in fact, from how you define it and the way I hear you describing it, undermines their ultimate goals? Or do they not even have the common goals of like actual liberation, and they're just satisfied with proximity to white male power?
I would argue more so the former. I mean, a big sort of parameter that I found in researching this book, but also putting it together and assembling it across, again, so many movements, is that white feminist practices and white feminists, I argue, are actually advocating for very different things than, say, like the disability justice movement or even like fat politics or queer movements. They're basically encouraging more women to get involved in the current systems rather than to change the systems, to really support and in some ways like substantiate more people.
Wow, that is revealing. I want to further it. One of my colleagues, Anoa Changa, said something years ago that stuck with me, and she said, "Corporate feminism does not trickle down." Would you draw an analog between like corporate feminism and white feminism?
Sure. So I trace in my book, a lot of what has been deemed like corporate feminism. Some people say girl boss feminism. Barbara Smith says bourgeois feminism. I analyze a lot of these in tandem and together as one movement, because I think what very importantly threads them together is this aspiration to whiteness. And so they are encouraging women and non-binary people to not necessarily work towards equal rights, but to aspire towards white privilege. And I've seen that, on a one-to-one level, but even just in historical analysis in terms of, encouraging, say, like same-sex couples, to really engage in this kind of like heterosexist understanding of like policy or the way that rights should be shaped. Basically encouraging like working class people to ascend to middle class rather than like challenging a lot of the structures that determine class in this country.
So how do we unpack that in terms of action? And because if there's a segment of feminism that is encouraging other groups to aspire to their particular brand, while the rest of us are understanding that it's the structural problems underneath that need to be changed, right? If what Dr. King said, a threat to justice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. How do we convert that, or how did you address it in your book? Like, what are the action steps people should look at and be wary of, or be knowledgeable of?
In the last third of my book, I lay out what I deem to be a course correction for white feminism that I think can work, on both a one-to-one level in terms of, checking your own, white feminism, but also I think, for institutions, for structures, for bodies. Generally, what I'll say is that I think it's important to, in controlling for a white feminist approach, to start your gender consciousness or your feminist politics at basic need. A big telltale sign of white feminism is that it often starts, again, as a practice and in terms of policies, it starts at, lofty educational opportunities and then small business and enterprise. And that's where it starts. Because the assumption in white feminism is that everybody has a basic standard of living. Whereas, for most marginalized genders in our country and even globally, they're not necessarily looking to be like heads of lofty companies. They're looking to be food secure. They're looking for access to clean water. So my general advice is to start there at basic need, and also to approach feminism with a collective understanding in terms of what women and non-binary people around you need. I always say, the clean on-ramp to the white feminism freeway is understanding feminism solely through your own individual needs, rather than what the women in your community need, the women in your workplace, the women, in your family. So I think those two things can really help.
And with the time that we have left, could you discuss? I listened to a panel that you had. I believe it was with Barbara Smith, and along with a couple of other fascinating and brilliant minds. And someone said, or perhaps you said, that when you find power that is yours, that there's sometimes you have to cede that power, right? How do you talk about that in context of feminism and white feminism?
Well, a lot of times what I have seen in this particular round of white feminism, and I learned through the course of this book that this is not new, but this idea that, the structures, as we've said, stay the same, but then a lot of these institutional bodies will use queer people, people of color, disabled people, Muslim people, as like ornaments basically to the structures being the change. And Sarah Ahmed, who is another brilliant feminist thinker, she calls this institutional polishing, which I cite in my book. So I think that white feminism, inherits and uses that strategy in that, again, the core issues are still lofty education, small business and enterprise, and yet you're recruiting, very specific women of color to stand there and like diversify your panel of, otherwise like entirely white straight ladies.
Koa, I wish we had much more time to discuss this. Author of White Feminism, From Suffragettes to Influencers and Who They Leave Behind. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Pleasure's ours.
Thanks for watching The Young Turks. Really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.